Y'all know I'm a storyteller, so I'm excited to share this upcoming event. The Newberry Library is kicking off its fall season with Chicago storytelling this Saturday, September 20th. This celebration features conversations among award-winning authors on a variety of topics from the Great Chicago Fire, the renovation of the Salt Shed, and the Underground Railroad in Northeast Illinois. This free event gets underway at 1 p.m. Saturday and is available in person or online. Learn more and register at newberry.org. There's still time to take advantage of Window Nation's most popular offer. When you buy 2 windows this month, you're going to get 2 for free. You don't want to wait when it comes to replacing old drafty windows if you can. Plus, Window Nation installation crews finish the job in a day or less so you can get back to your daily life with little interruption. And you know that your home is protected from fall and winter weather. This sale ends September 30th, so schedule a fast free estimate now with the pros at Window Nation. Call 866-90-NATION or head to windownation.com. Today on CityCast Chicago. What happens when you go to check who your landlord is and instead of a person, you find a company? And then when you go to look who owns that company, well, you find yet another company. This is becoming increasingly common in Chicago. So what does that mean for renters trying to get a leak fixed? It's Monday, September 15th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago is talking about. Amy Chen is a data reporter at WBEZ. Thank you for joining us, Amy.
Thank you for having me.
Esther Yoon-Ji Kang is a reporter on the Race, Class, and Communities desk at WBEZ. Thank you for joining us, Esther.
Glad to be here, Jacoby.
You both came out with an investigation looking at Chicago's invisible property owners. First off, what do we mean when we say invisible property owners? Like, how does someone become invisible?
Well, so Jacoby, there used to be a time when if you looked up a building or a property, you would see the person's name on it. You would see the owner's name on it. And more often than not, that was the landlord. So if you are a renter in Chicago, you look this building up, you would see this name, and that would be the guy you would talk to about paying your rent. If something was breaking in your building, that would be the guy. Now, that is changing, and more buildings are being owned by LLCs, which are limited liability companies. And, today, about a third of all mid to large sized rental buildings in Chicago are actually owned by LLCs. And so instead of a name, instead of somebody who has a face, you have this company. It's hard to find out who's behind that company. And the increase in LLC ownership in Chicago has gone up, from about under 10% 2 decades ago to like a third now. So that's quite an increase in just 2 decades.
So when somebody goes look for their property owner, if they see LLC and they're not familiar with what that means, that's a limited liability company. Can you explain what that is when we're talking about real estate, and why would a landlord choose to use an LLC name under a building instead of their actual identity?
They're essentially just kind of like legal entities, right? They are some called shell companies. And the main reason we've heard from landlords and property investors is that it's a way to separate your assets from legal liability. So if you own multiple properties, you can put each and every one of those properties in a different LLC. So if a lender comes after one of them, it doesn't affect your other properties or your family home, for instance. So it's really kind of a risk management tool for investors. The problem is, like Esther mentioned, is just the very minimal disclosure required. You essentially don't have to reveal who you are if you don't want to as an owner of an LLC. Basically, in Illinois, you're required to submit a manager of the LLC and an agent. And neither of those people have to be any owners with any investment stake in the LLC.
In fact, they could be another LLC.
Exactly. Yes, we've found that is the case for a lot of LLCs, and in particular, the kind of portfolio we profiled in the story. But yeah, it could be another LLC, it could be an attorney, it could be a registered agent, another company, really anything but the owner.
Yeah, so essentially it's a legal entity that indicates, right, a business rather than a person. Like anyone who wants to start a business can create an LLC. I can create Jacoby Cochran LLC, deal with all my freelance work. I know there isn't like an inherent relationship that is like, you're not saying that just because someone owns property through an LLC, that makes them more likely to be a negligent property owner. It is just a sense of, it just does create transparency issues potentially.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, Jacoby, the thing is that a lot of these people are not naming these LLCs Jacoby Cochran LLC. They're naming them, Awesome Apartments LLC or just the address of the building LLC. And you're absolutely right. Just because it's an LLC, it doesn't mean that this landlord is negligent or nefarious. It just means that if you are an investor who's just looking to make a quick buck and get out, or if you are somebody who doesn't take care of his or her building, that means that it's easier for that person to hide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was thinking about some of the people I know who do own property. They aren't going out of their way to be hidden. They may own it through an LLC, but they're also the daily property manager. Even if they have a company, they are easy to contact. Their name is on like the documentation or the website portal or things like that. You point out in your reporting that LLCs are becoming more and more common. How common is it now in the Chicago housing landscape versus just a couple of decades ago?
Yeah, so this was a pretty big data lift that we did in partnership with the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation at the University of Chicago and Injustice Watch. And we essentially downloaded, I think, 26 million property records. So every single property tax bill from 2006 to 2022. And we looked for mentions of LLCs in the taxpayer name. And so what we found is, in 2006, LLCs accounted for about 3% of all what we're calling multifamily rentals. So basically buildings with more than 2 units. So it went from 3% to 16% in 2022. And then among these kind of larger buildings, what we're calling 7+ unit buildings, it went from 9% to 34% in just the span of 2 decades. So even this is probably an undercount. The way that we counted them, we're looking at mentions of LLCs in people's tax filings, but, people can put whatever they want on their tax filing. So oftentimes we noticed, they'll leave off LLCs. So if their LLC is named Awesome Apartments LLC, they'll just put Awesome Apartments. And so our percentage is actually probably lower than what it actually is.
Do you all have a sense of what's driving this trend? Why are more and more property owners pushing towards this route than in previous decades?
Well, the thing about LLCs is, a little bit of history. It started in the 70s. The LLC was born in the 70s. It was for oil companies, I believe. And they kind of gained traction in real estate in the 1990s. And investors started realizing, hey, this is a great way to, keep my assets separated so that I don't get sued if, for all of my assets, if, a renter takes me to court or a lender wants my building back.
I mean, it's also pretty easy to do and cheap. I think in Illinois, it costs $150 to file for an LLC. So, if you're a real estate investor and you're thinking about putting your property in a corporation versus an LLC, it's just a lot easier to work with LLCs now.
I mean, when you're going through all of these properties, you're also trying to maybe link up, because some property owners may own multiple LLCs or start an LLC for every property. Like, how do you connect those various webs of LLCs owning an LLC or managing or being an agent, and, one property owner or group of investors having a bunch out there across the city? How do you make those connections?
I mean, the short answer is it can be a big headache. It can be hours and hours of painstaking research across public documents, different databases. For a lot of landlords who aren't trying to hide, right? It's pretty easy to figure out who owns the LLC. They list their name as the manager, and maybe they call all their properties the same LLC. But for certain landlords who maybe are trying to, not be as transparent. If you put your LLC in a different name, every property in a different LLC named after the address of that property, there's no like pattern recognition that you can do to kind of group them together. And right now, there's actually no good way, no one kind of system or database you can go to look up what other properties an LLC owns. The city of Chicago doesn't necessarily maintain that. And so there's been a couple of, I would say, like kind of citizen data scientists and researchers who have gone through that process of, looking things up on the state's website, looking things up on the Cook County Assessor's website, and just using data science and algorithms to kind of match them all together and group what they think are likely owners and what buildings, one LLC likely owns in the city.
And, we link to some of those tools in our story. But the thing to point out there is that these are kind of best guesses. It's really hard to find for, exactly who owns what and how many other buildings and of course, what people are going through in those buildings.
Look, you know it, I know it, I say it all the time. Chicago is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and a major reason why is because we got some of the most amazing architecture on the planet. And if you've ever seen one of our many magnificent buildings and thought, I wonder what the story behind that is, or even I wonder what it's like inside, then I got the perfect event for you. Open House Chicago from the Chicago Architecture Center is back, y'all. October 18th and 19th is one of the city's largest free festivals, giving you behind the scenes access to more than 200 sites across dozens of neighborhoods. I'm talking iconic skyscrapers, sacred spaces, historic buildings, artist hangouts, these steel, limestone, concrete, glass masterpieces, some places that are usually closed to the public. You can finally step inside a building you've always passed or see the city from a whole new angle and a part of town you ain't never been to. And the best part, no tickets required. You can just pull up and start exploring. Visit openhousechicago.org to see the full site list. Plus, they got maps so you can plan your whole weekend. Mark your calendar, October 18th and 19th, and experience Chicago like never before at openhousechicago.org. If you're looking for a new career, I want you to pause for a second. What exactly are you looking for? Maybe it's something that's flexible, that works on your time, something where you can use those people skills, your creativity to work with and connect others. Something where you can make an impact. If the answer is yes, then maybe you should consider real estate. Realtors not only help people buy and sell homes, but navigate Chicago's rental market. They help people find the next great location to realize the small business dreams, which means you can help people find stability, put down roots, grow something in their neighborhoods. Plus, you get to set your own schedule, choose who you work with, explore different parts of the city. So if real estate is for you, here's how to get started. Visit realtorsrealestateschool.com today to schedule your free career consultation. That's realtorsrealestateschool.com. September is Childhood Cancer Awareness Month, and kidney cancer is one of the most common types of childhood cancer. The Kidney Cancer Association is committed to creating awareness and raising funds for research to find a cure through Chalk Your Walk. Basically, you chalk some art on the pavement, maybe in your driveway or on the sidewalk outside your apartment. Include chalkyourwalk.org on your drawing, then post photos of your art on social media and tag Kidney Cancer Association. Seriously, you can draw anything, something that brings you joy or an encouraging message, and just tag Kidney Cancer Association. Learn more or donate directly at chalkyourwalk.org. I remember living in an apartment in South Shore that was pretty quietly sold while we were living in the building. And some of our issues with the back porch, with some pests, these things were reported to the first company. And then that portal just stopped working, but we weren't really given all of the information we needed. And so there was some time before we were able to get in contact with the new managers, the new property owners. You all spoke with many tenants about the problems they face in their apartments, which landlords had neglected for weeks and months. Folks like Russell Carter, who couldn't safely use the bathroom in their home, couldn't figure out who their property owner. Can you all share this experience and what you heard from renters living in these sort of buildings owned by invisible property owners?
The story that we just published focused on one particular group of tenants whose buildings were part of a network of LLCs. And, all the buildings were owned by different LLCs, with names like 7655 South Coles LLC. But when you dig deeper, you find out it's owned by kind of the same group of investors. And so for months and sometimes for years, these tenants said that they dealt with rodent infestations, utility shutoffs, leaks that made the whole ceiling cave, and rats falling into their sink, mushrooms growing in your apartment from the water, the moisture. And that was for one particular group of tenants in South Shore. Now, for some upcoming stories, we also spoke to other tenants across the city who experienced outrageous rent hikes when it went from an individual to an LLC owner. People who experienced evictions due to, owners saying, you know what, we're going to renovate this and then rent it out for twice the price. And so these are some of the experiences that we've heard. It's not just about squalid conditions or, serious issues in their buildings, but it's also sometimes, having to find a new place to live because of renovictions and evictions and rent hikes.
Yeah, I was given the opportunity when the new landlords took over to move. They were renovating like a different property to move into that one. Essentially, all they did was change out, I think, the stove and the microwave, but the issues in the building were the exact same. And I was paying maybe 50% more in rent. When a person is trying to report these issues, trying to track someone down, what do they do when they kind of run into this, ultimately this fence of information where, they don't know who to contact on the other side? What are they left to do?
Well, I think the issue is that generally your first point of contact is the portal, right? They always say, go to this site, go to this website and fill out a ticket, essentially. That's kind of how a lot of property managers go about handling the business of managing a building. But tenants, I think one of the things they can do is what the group of tenants in our story did, which is organize, form a tenants union. And so they started talking to each other and they said, hey, are you having the same problems that I am having? Some people did some real research and found out who the managers of the LLCs were and who that person was, what else they managed. Now, a lot of people don't have the time or luxury to do that, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's where folks can connect with housing organizers, like groups like Southside Together, for example, which is the group that helped, the folks in our story.
You can also, file a complaint with the city. You can call 311 and let them know that you are having issues with your building. And ideally, they'll send out a building inspector to come and see if those are actually violations of the city's building code. So having rodents, not having heat, not having utilities, these are all violations of the city's building code.
So once these residents come together, they unionize, they do this, difficult work of linking some of these properties. It's found out that multiple properties under this group had failed previous building code violations. How did the city respond to this organization linking this episode together? Was there any way to hold someone accountable at the end of all of this?
So the union has kind of, they've been in meetings with their alderperson, Alderman Desmond Yancey. They've had meetings with the mayor, even with the city's building commissioner. We did go to the city for comment, and although they weren't able to comment on the specific portfolio of buildings because it's involved in ongoing litigation, they did say that they face a lot of the same issues that tenants face when they try to figure out who owns these LLCs and what else they own. And so that they are also limited by the fact that, people are putting things behind LLCs.
They obviously had so many things going on in their apartments, demands, were their conditions met? Was Russell Carter's bathroom ever renovated?
So for Russell Carter, he went 4 months without being able to safely use his bathroom. And then in late May, he actually switched property managers, and they finally came in to finish fixing up, the giant holes in his drywall.
Mm-hmm. I've been there before. A couple years ago, I had them come in, address the leak, and then just leave the ceiling open for 2 months.
He recently actually discovered that his ceiling started leaking again. And so even though it was patched up in May, he sent us videos of, you can see water droplets and just the water damage on his bathroom ceiling and wall coming back because they never fixed the actual source of the leak, which was his upstairs neighbor's toilet that was basically leaking every time it flushed. Russell Carter is part of the union's bargaining committee. He's been pretty vocal about the conditions in his building, talking to media, talking at press conferences. And on July 22nd, he was part of this negotiations meeting with some of the investors and other members of the tenant union, where he identified who he was and where he lived. And that meeting happened at 9 a.m. on July 22nd. He gets an eviction notice a couple weeks later that, according to the court documents, was filed just a few hours after that July 22nd meeting. And so Russell believes that this is retaliation for him speaking up. But the eviction notice is for 2 months of unpaid rent. Tenants who try to withhold rent to get better conditions, get things fixed, oftentimes if you don't kind of dot your I's and cross your T's to the letter of the law, in this case, Russell, he verbally told him that he was withholding his rent to get certain things fixed in his apartment, but he actually needed to write a written letter with 14 days notice in order to do that. And so since he didn't have the letter, under the Chicago Residential Landlord-Tenant Ordinance, his landlords can file for an eviction for him not paying the rent, even though he told them in advance verbally. And he also mentioned multiple times that he had tried to pay the rent, but was unable to because he was locked out of the payment portal. They were just not going to take his rent, and they just wanted to move forward with the eviction. And so he's still kind of fighting that eviction case. It's ongoing, but he has some help from legal aid, and so and he has kind of the strength of the union behind him as well.
As you all have uncovered, we've talked with the Invisible Institute, the Injustice Watch. Like, anytime people do these stories, it's clear across neighborhoods, across the city, that people are dealing with some of these same issues. And time again, a lot of it goes back to Chicago has renter protection laws on the books, but the strength of those laws, the strength of those protections, you're legally allowed to withhold rent. But then so many people who do that then find themselves facing a hasty eviction.
And in fact, landlords often say, oh, Chicago is such a renter-friendly place and renters have all the power. Well, that's actually not true necessarily, because if, say, something goes to building court, there's been Injustice Watch reporting that's found that judges are actually very hesitant to take punitive measures against landlords. And so this idea that renters have all the power, I think, is not entirely accurate, I would say.
Is there any real comprehensive way for the city to track problem landlords or LLCs and enforce the rules that are on the books?
So there's a couple of ways the city does track landlords and problem landlords. I would say none of them are necessarily comprehensive. So one of them is the building scofflaw list, and that is like a public database of some 600 properties across Chicago that have chronic building code violations and have been in building court for over a year and a half. But the problem with that is that relies on tenants to call 311 complaints to actually request a building inspector come. And we talked to tenant advocates who said, oftentimes tenants are afraid of retaliation, of getting evicted from their, apartments for speaking up. Or oftentimes when they do call 311, a building inspector comes and the tenant isn't home. And so there's just a lot of kind of ways that issues fall through the cracks and don't end up getting on the city's radar. And so that's one of the reasons why the scofflaw list is quite incomplete. And in fact, we actually went through all 600 properties on the scofflaw list, and none of the 31 buildings that tenants that we talked to live in showed up on that list. So that's one way the city kind of keeps track of problem landlords. The other way is through another program. It's called the Troubled Buildings Initiative. And this one is basically buildings that have been kind of vacant for a long time or just in various stages of disrepair. And these buildings get referred to the city by either, members of the law department who are already dealing with buildings in building court, or, alder people or community organizations. But again, that list, we FOIA'd for, and it's about 1,300 buildings, and just 7 of the 31 buildings in the CKO portfolio are currently on that list. So these two kind of ways the city keeps track definitely have buildings, but it's nowhere near complete.
Yeah, this makes me think about the story that folks have been tracking over the last couple of years of quote unquote Chicago's worst landlord, property owner Susie Wilson. I think her sister, they had racked up over $15 million in fines, had let 800 or so properties in the broader Chicagoland area kind of fall into disrepair, sit years, neglected. And the city ended up suing them, taking legal action against them after a Block Club Chicago and Illinois Answers Project investigation. But the entire time I'm thinking, how poor does our system have to be for somebody to be able to amass this much in fines and this many properties without as much of an annual check-in or some type of accountability measures? It feels like you can't get this bad just on your own. A lot of people have to be negligent in this process.
Chicago doesn't have annual building inspections. It is very much just like tenants complain, we come, but other cities do. And so that's something that advocates have really long called for, is like, if we know that our building is gonna get inspected once a year, that means it's, whatever problems happen aren't going to be left to fester for years on end without, any sort of awareness from the city. And so that's one way that we could kind of keep chronically problem landlords accountable.
Mm-hmm. I mean, how can the process of finding out who your landlord is be more transparent for tenants in Chicago? What are some fixes the city can take?
What people are really advocating for is a thing called a rental registry. And they want to have something that says, who is the owner of this building, their contact information, data on rents and the number of units available, something that's really transparent for everybody to be able to see, whom to contact if there's a problem. And so this is a measure that is currently proposed in city council, but it's currently stalled in committee. And so that's something I think a lot of people have been advocating for years. If someone wants to track their landlord, what can they do? Call Amy. Call Amy. No, I'm just kidding.
Injustice Watch has an excellent guide for doing this. First, you have to go to the Cook County Assessor's website. And so that's the agency, tasked with collecting your taxes and property taxes. Look up your property on that, and then kind of scroll down. You'll see a section for recent transactions or recent sales. There you'll be able to see who the most recent buyer of your property is. And so if it's the name of your landlord, great, that's who owns the building. If it's an LLC, then there's a second step involved, and you have to copy the name of that LLC and go to the Illinois Secretary of State's website. It's called the Business Entity Search, and this is essentially a database of all the LLC filings in the state of Illinois. So you have to put that LLC name in that search, and it'll return results that show you the manager and the agent of an LLC. Again, neither of these are necessarily the owners, but more often than not, the manager is, if there's a name of a person, it's likely the owner. It may not be. But if there's another LLC listed as the manager, you have to kind of rinse and repeat and go through that process again and look up that LLC again. So it's a multi-step process through kind of different public records that are available.
Amy, I appreciate you making time for CityCast Chicago today. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks.
As always, Esther, I appreciate you making time for CityCast Chicago.
Thanks so much for having us.
You know, we can't leave without some good news. The 32nd annual Chicago Underground Film Festival is going down this week. It starts Wednesday and runs through Sunday. It's going to be held at the Gene Siskel Film Center and Harper Theater. I'll drop a link for you in the show notes. As always, we appreciate you for listening and reading. We're going to be back bright and early tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. Peace.